Hello and welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're taking a look at History Matters' new video, How Close Was the U.S. to Another Civil War in 1876? Few thoughts right off the get-go here. I'm curious, I'm assuming that they're discussing specifically the contentious election between Tilden and Hayes. I'm sure that we'll get into that. But I'd argue we were still in a more or less guerrilla state of war throughout a lot of Reconstruction. Uh, Reconstruction saw consistent, continued Confederate aligned raiders, the Bushwhackers, groups like Jesse James, while they didn't directly claim that they were an arm of the old Confederacy, they were largely a group born out of their time in the Civil War as raiders and then continued that work afterward. Throughout much of the South, you get a lot of violence. You have the rise of white supremacist groups like the KKK, the White Gentlemen's League, the Southern League, all these different groups that violently suppress the newly found civil rights that African Americans have post slavery and then turn around and basically punish that group. Uh, we end up seeing a large amount of U.S. troops end up being stationed in the South, occupying it to try to stabilize and end the violence. And there's a lot of things within. So we've got a lot to discuss, I'm sure. Let's go ahead and get started.
The United States has, in the past, had some hotly contested elections, but only in a few of them did the political temperature run as high as the election of 1876, which saw the governor of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, victorious and sworn in as president, whereas Samuel J. Tilden, his opponent, had won the popular vote as well as the Electoral College, until he hadn't.
And that's for a pretty good reason that they debate this. And realistically, I don't know how well we could accurately say the honest outcome, but unlike the kind of ridiculous statements about voter fraud or election fraud today, it was a very real and very prevalent thing in the Reconstruction era South. And it wasn't so much an idea of like, oh, we're going to stuff the ballot box, which did probably happen. I think South Carolina ends up voting more people vote than were eligible to in the 1876 election. But specifically, Florida and Louisiana and also are contentious. There's a lot of violence being had throughout the South, and there's a lot of voter intimidation. This is also pre-anonymous ballot, the Australian ballot, as it's nicknamed, where you get to go in and you get to vote for whoever you want, and nobody knows who you voted for. That wasn't a thing in 1876. That was like a turn of the century innovation in American politics. And it leads to a lot of voter intimidation and a lot of bigger issues when it comes to elections during this period. There's also issues with the black codes, although we'll discuss that later, I'm sure. I'm sure that he's going to bring it up when we actually get to the election itself. But that's a problem.
At this time, anger and resentment at former Civil War opponents was commonplace across the United States, and as the nature of this election's results became clear and how quickly they then changed, many Americans feared that both Hayes and Tilden would simultaneously have themselves inaugurated as president, acts which would then obviously bring the country to the brink of another civil war. But how justified were these fears? How close was the United States to another civil war in the wake of the election of 1876?
It's a good question. I'd argue probably not as close as people would think, given that. But we'll see.
So as you'll know,
because here's the thing. My actual, I know the broad strokes of the 1876 election. I don't know a lot of the nittier, grittier details within, especially the in-between period. I just smacked the mic. I hope that didn't cause too much of a problem. But I don't know a lot about the minutia within that period between the election itself in November and the inauguration in March. If that confuses you, by the way, eventually, U.S. constitutional amendment, the 22nd Amendment. Is it the 22nd? Or is it the 20th? It's the 20th Amendment. The 20th Amendment limits, or brings forward when the inauguration day is from March to January. So previously, it had been a March inauguration prior to that, in I think 1930, or it was between FDR's two terms. No, it was at the start of his first term, so 1932 would be when that happened.
The American Civil War ended in 1865 with the defeat of the Confederacy and the end of slavery as an institution. And after this, the victorious US government had the difficult task of reincorporating the defeated states back into the Union. This was done via a process known as Reconstruction, which was neither popular nor successful.
And that's an immediate division inside of the federal government as well. There are effectively three major plans for Reconstruction, or at least three major plans that we discuss in history classes. And when I say that, I don't mean just like mine, I mean AP. Three ones that are primarily being discussed when that gets brought up. There's the 10% plan, which is Abraham Lincoln's idea to bring states back in toward the end of the Civil War. Of course, Abraham Lincoln ends up being assassinated, and that leaves Southern Democrat Andrew Johnson, as the president, isn't it? He has a lot of Southern leanings. He's a lot of favor toward the Southern states. He had stayed in the Union. He had continued to serve for the Union during the war, even though Tennessee had joined the Confederacy. But he was not okay with the idea of civil rights being granted to African Americans. He sucks. Andrew Johnson is easily top 5 worst presidents, arguably top 3. Maybe, depending on who you ask, could be top 1. Up 1. I'm not, that's not why we're here today, though, to rank them. Which is a huge problem for a country that's trying to unify. When he's got very specific ideas, that ends up becoming known as presidential reconstruction, as his beliefs and his supports. Meanwhile, the Congress has its own, which has been widely called congressional or radical reconstruction because of the radical Republicans that lead it during this time period. So there's a big gap between the two. There's a lot of overriding of Johnson's vetoes in Congress. I believe that the most presidential vetoes are overridden up to that point during Johnson's presidency. That's a pretty big deal. That's a pretty big show that Congress does not agree with or support what he's doing.
Reconstruction saw the Confederacy divided into occupation zones and run by military governors from the Union. All slaves within them were freed, and the federal government granted itself much greater authority and power to act within those states. For a state to end this status and rejoin the United States properly, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment, which gave everyone born within the
and you'll see that amongst
status and rejoin the United States properly, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment.
So there's a few different pieces, there's a few different things. Individuals had to swear loyalty to the Union, to the United States as a whole, rather than the Confederacy. And there is a large number of processes that have to go into this. This is a very controversial, a very trying time. Fighting a war is never easy, but cleaning up a conflict inside of your own borders is horrifically difficult.
Which gave everyone born within the US American citizenship and granted them all equal rights under the law.
Yep, and that's still the same thing. Birthright citizenship finds its roots in the 14th Amendment, as would later be confirmed by the Supreme Court in, Wong Kim Ark. Let me make sure that I have that right. Yes, the Wong Kim Ark case um, ends up verifying and supporting the idea that American citizen, in any individual born inside of America's borders, is an American citizen. So that comes out of that 14th Amendment, and it's initially there to guarantee African Americans citizenship, because previously the Dred Scott case had determined that slaves and African Americans couldn't be citizens of the United States.
At least in theory. In practice, no.
And that's what we were discussing prior with the violence that's happening. These are all representations of white supremacist groups that pop up throughout the South. And eventually, thanks to the federal government and the actions therein with the military, groups like the Klan are ultimately stomped out during this period, only to then come back later. Because racists and racism is like cockroaches. You can't ever fully stomp it out.
No. Once they had ratified the 14th Amendment, these southern states were readmitted. 5 seconds after this, many of them passed laws which restricted the rights of black citizens, heavily suppressed their ability to vote, and also turned a blind eye to violence against them. You'd think that this would be a violation of their terms of readmission, which would then come with some consequences, but sad fact, no. The reason that they got away with this was that officially these things weren't done on the basis of race.
And that's a big thing that you'll notice with racist policies throughout history. If there is, for instance, it is unconstitutional to pass a law that limits someone's right or ability based on their race, color, or sex. However, if you word it right, you can have that affect someone, but not directly claim them. And therefore, it's found a legal loophole. And we end up seeing that during this period. We end up seeing poll taxes. Do African Americans who just got freed from slavery have access to the money for a poll tax? No. They are put to literacy tests. You have to be able to be literate to vote. What has been illegal in the American South for decades up to this point? It was illegal to teach slaves to read or write. And in many southern states, it was illegal for free African Americans to learn to read and write. Right? So there's a lot of restrictions that are placed on those. Meanwhile, the actual prosecution of individuals is left up to the local courts. Right? We end up seeing groups basically get away with murder, literally speaking. The KKK and those other white supremacist groups are lynching people across the American South. And as they do that, Southern law enforcement isn't going after them. That's why it ends up becoming necessary for garrison troops to go after the KKK. And the passage of federal legislation around that, the so-called, it's the nickname, but it's the actual enforcement acts, but it's the Ku Klux Klan acts, as they end up being nicknamed under Grant's administration, are specifically aimed at stopping that threat, which the southern states are failing to handle. But ultimately, a lot of these laws end up being more or less upheld. The slaughterhouse cases dismantle the protections of the 14th and 15th Amendment for a lot of African Americans. And then eventually, in 1893, we see the black codes dissipate in favor of Plessy v. Ferguson and the separate but equal doctrine, which is also wildly racist, but was a lot easier for a lot of people to swallow at the time. Even beyond that, though, those black codes were used for a large number of things. A lot of southern regions put in place vagrancy laws. You needed to have some place to stay. Otherwise, you were in violation of the law and you would be arrested and sent to jail. We'll get to that. We'll come back to that in a second. Or there were also work requirements. If you did not have a work contract somewhere, then you would also be liable for arrest. And there is one very specific limitation to the 13th Amendment. Those duly convicted of a crime. So if you effectively make being homeless and not having work, which how many former slaves are stuck in that situation directly following the 13th Amendment, now they're stuck in very hard circumstances. They have to sign work contracts, they have to find jobs, they have to find places to stay, which puts them in a lot of bad positions. And this ends up leading to a lot of them being arrested and then basically rented out to plantations as slaves, effectively. Technically, that is still a loophole. Some states, most states pay imprisoned individuals. Usually it's pennies on the dollar. Usually it's very, very cheaply. But that is still legal in the United States as a punishment for a crime.
But instead were based upon things.
And that only literate piece is a big one. And property, poll taxes are huge too. And what they would do is a lot of Southern poor whites also didn't have the money to pay a poll tax or the additional studying or education to be able to pass a literacy test. So what they would do is they would also pass what were called grandfather clauses. These were guarantees that, hey, if your grandfather was eligible to vote prior to the 1860 election, you're good. You don't have to worry about that poll tax. You don't have to worry about that literacy test. Who was eligible to vote prior to the election of 1860? It was white men in the South. So they find a workaround. They find loopholes to basically just skirt around these new constitutional protections for people.
Things like property ownership and literacy, which were only very heavily correlated with race, which is technically different. Over the next decade, things only got more heated, which brings us to the 1876 election.
God, we're not even to the actual election yet. I know that I've been going off on that. It's such an infuriating period. And the federal government is trying to prevent all-out sparking another civil war. But in that pursuit, they really just leave people out to dry. The African Americans that had finally gained their independence from the slave-owning class get completely abandoned in this process. There are groups that are sent down to assist them, groups like the Freedmen's Bureau, the establishment of HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities all across the country, but it is a devastating reality that we see a pretty major push for civil rights initially directly after the Civil War, and by the time that Reconstruction ends in 76, that movement's well and truly dead in much of the South.
Came at the end of Ulysses S. Grant's second term as president, who at this point was unpopular due to numerous corruption scandals as well as being seen as out of touch with the average American.
Yeah, which one of those things is actually Reconstruction. A lot of Americans had turned against it. The violence in the South, the problems that were continuing, the high burden, and the panic of 1873 all really hurt Grant. He actually thought about running for a third term, but ended up not getting the nomination. And yeah, he was out of his element. He wanted to continue supporting Reconstruction. Uh, and that is a big deal during this period. But all those corruption scandals, uh, the credit mobiler scandal, all of those just devastated his presidency. And while I'd argue that he did the best with what he could at the time, man, he let some really, really bad choices in his cabinet just destroy his legacy.
Knowledge of this led to the Republicans nominating the more moderate Rutherford B. Hayes, who wanted reconciliation with the South, whereas the Democrats chose Samuel J. Tilden, whose being the governor of New York was hoped could swing the state away from the Republicans, and his economic policies were well liked in the South.
Which makes sense. New York's a huge population base, and that could really shift voting and the election as a whole to Tilden.
Many of whose white residents just wanted the Republicans out of office and the end of Reconstruction. The election was a close one, and because information travelled somewhat slowly, each party was mostly working with estimates. The next day, the Democrats proclaimed that Tilden had won the popular vote as well as all of these states, thereby giving him 203 electoral votes, well over the 185 he needed to win. However, the Republicans claimed that in fact Hayes had actually won all of these states, and the only one which was too close to call was Florida, thereby giving Hayes 181 electoral votes to Tilden's 184, with Florida's 4 votes still in play. It won't surprise you to learn that after this things became quite tense because there were some irregularities that occurred in these 3 states during the vote. In both Louisiana and Florida, violence and fraud had been a big issue. You see, unlike the modern day, there wasn't any standardization of ballots or methods of voting, and in these 2 states, votes were often cast by posting pre-printed party ballots, and the ballots used by the Democrats had been intentionally designed to look like Republican ones, which was believed to have tricked some illiterate voters, i.e. many of them, into voting for the wrong party. Whereas South Carolina had managed the impressive feat of casting more votes than the stated eligible voters.
I mean, it's not good to do that. It's extremely misleading. It's extremely problematic. But the violence was such a major issue throughout this period. Voter intimidation was massive. Now, voter intimidation does not disappear anytime soon. It arguably gets worse until we eventually institute the anonymous ballot. But that's a big deal.
Whereas South Carolina had managed the impressive feat of casting more votes than the stated eligible voters. As such, the still in charge but probably not for much longer Republican-run state governments within these states quickly removed the votes that they considered ineligible, i.e.
And this is where we get
for much longer Republican-run state governments within these states quickly removed the votes that they considered ineligible.
Is how do you properly do this? How do you properly determine which ones are cast fraudulently and which ones aren't? I do find it fascinating that Louisiana, even by Republican estimates, still goes to Tilden in the election.
Ones for the Democrats, and Hayes was soon given these 3 states and therefore the presidency. I.e. the longer Republican-run state governments within these states quickly removed the votes that they considered ineligible.
Is that an incorrect placement there? Because this would suggest that Tilden still wins in the electoral votes out of Louisiana. But that's besides the point.
I.e. the ones for the Democrats, and Hayes was soon given these 3 states and therefore the presidency. Obviously, this swift change was going to cause some resentment amongst the people, hence why the president-elect was soon given the nickname Rutherford B. Hayes by his opponent. Now, normally it would fall to...
And that's still been maintained. The whole idea of the corrupt bargain of 1877 is an ongoing theme. It's still discussed pretty heavily. And that nickname of Rutherford B. Hayes is still rather popular for him.
The vice president as head of the Senate to certify the election. But 1, he was too busy being dead, and 2, the man who had replaced him as head of the Senate was a Republican and no Democrat would accept his verdict. Furthermore, the Democrats argued that as the party in control of the House of Representatives under the 12th Amendment, it was up to them to choose the next president, which of course the Republicans were not okay with.
Yeah, if you've ever thought the political polarization was a modern issue, it's not. Now, to be fair, there are a lot of points in American history where we were not nearly as polarized as we are today, but by God, we were polarized.
Things were looking pretty bad, but guess what though? The 1876 election wasn't done. You see,
No.
Tilden wasn't a dummy, and he and his team knew that the Republicans would argue that the federal government had no jurisdiction to override the changed results that the state returned for the election. And so the Democrats got the governor of Oregon, an ally of Tilden, to replace one of the Republican Electoral College voters with the Democrat, who then voted for Tilden even though Oregon had swung for Hayes, thereby giving him one vote that he needed for victory.
Which is technically not illegal. Faithless electors are not illegal nationwide. There are some states, I believe, that have established laws that prevent what is called a faithless elector, someone who goes against the grain of their state. And if you are a faithless elector, you better know darn well that you are not going to get sent the next time that ballots are cast. But yeah, that's technically not illegal. Highly unethical, yes. Illegal, no.
It was at this point that people started to get really angry and talk of a civil war began in earnest. The incumbent President Grant ordered thousands of troops to take up positions in and around Washington, D.C. to protect Hayes during the transition of power. Hayes' swearing-in ceremony was also secretly moved forward by a day and privately into the White House. And furthermore, Democrats were also banned from the later public ceremony to prevent any potential incidents. Whereas on Tilden's behalf, numerous governors offered to call up state militias to fight for Tilden's presidency. And these divides weren't simply across previous Confederate Union lines either. Union General George B. McClellan was gathering soldiers in veteran societies and speaking to former Confederate leaders in case armed conflict should break out.
McClellan also had quite the chip on his shoulder. He managed a semi-successful time as the head of the Army of the Potomac. I know that people are going to lose their minds that I say semi-successful instead of just outright horrid. He wins the Battle of Antietam. He would have gotten his behind whooped without having found the literal battle plans that had been drawn up and understood what Lee was going to do. And he was very close to pulling off a victory for Richmond during his Peninsula campaign, but the Battle of the 7 Days ends up routing him. He's extremely cautious, and that ends up costing him his job, and he seems to have quite the chip on his shoulder the rest of the time that he is out there and lively. He runs against Abraham Lincoln in the election of 1864, basically with the implication that he's going to end the war with whatever means necessary. That might include just letting the South get away with what they've done and letting them go. But that makes a lot of sense that by this point, he is like, I'll throw my hand in with the guy that I think might be able to go in charge, and then maybe I can get a spiffy new position up in the federal government.
And some of Tilden's supporters also planned to set up their own inauguration in New York to challenge Hayes. At this point, many Americans were now terrified of another civil war and what
That is a horrific idea, though, that concept of a second inauguration claiming that somebody is the president as equal to the other. And that is a recipe for just a disaster.
They called the Mexicanization of American politics. And so, fearing another conflict, or at the very least mass civil disobedience, it was decided in the most Washington-esque move ever that this crisis would be solved by a commission.
That's a very congressional answer. Commission is a very congressional answer. They are very fond of them. But that whole idea of the Mexicanization, Mexico, and we discussed this a little bit previously when we had a video on how Mexico lost so much land so quickly. But their political structure is extremely unstable post-independence. They have emperors, they have duly elected presidents, they have dictators, caudillos, and then including a French invasion with a Austrian puppet on the throne. So there is just a long line of problems going on in Mexico. And the idea of this split reality at this point is extremely dangerous and extremely scary for people. Remember, everybody remembers the Civil War at this point. Kids that were born during or just after it, they still are walking through the streets and seeing the remnants and the effects of the war. The number of amputees nationwide is insanely high because of the lack of surgical field equipment and knowledge. So one of the main ways to prevent loss of life was loss of a limb if it was really mangled or really destroyed. And so people are still regularly seeing the effects of the Civil War all around the country. And it is a horrific idea, not to mention the fact that Grant fought in the war, or Hayes fought in the war. I don't know if Tilden did. But a lot of these big names are all veterans. The only one that I can think of, the only president from the end of Abraham Lincoln to the taking over of the presidency by Teddy Roosevelt in 1901, and the only one that did not serve in the military in the Civil War is Andrew Johnson. So that's a huge get. Actually, question. Battlefield Trust is a very good one. Nope. So it looks like no. It looks like he did not serve. So he is literally the only president between Lincoln's assassination and the inauguration of Teddy Roosevelt to not serve in the Civil War. That is a huge thing, and everybody's going to remember the impacts of it. So nobody wants this to happen. Nobody wants another Civil War to happen.
Said commission would have 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans, 3 from the House, 2 from the Senate, and 2 from the Supreme Court. And it would also have 1 non-partisan Supreme Court judge who would ultimately be the tiebreaker. And both parties did the unthinkable, and they agreed on something. They agreed that said member would be Justice David Davis because he was seen as a fundamentally honourable man. But it was here that the Democrats had a fantastic idea. Let's win him over to our side by offering to make him a senator. A position which he accepted, but because he was said honourable man, he felt that this would sway his vote, and so he resigned the commission.
So they tried to bribe him. He accepted the bribe, and then he went, no, that was a bribe. I shouldn't take that. And he quit. They shot themselves in the foot. Very classic.
He was then replaced with another justice, this time a Republican because all of the remaining justices were, and after a series of partisan votes, Hayes won the election with 185 Electoral College votes to Tilden's 184. Importantly, it had been agreed beforehand that this commission's decision would be final, unless of course both halves of Congress rejected it, but since only the House did,
and remember, the House at this point is dominated by Democrats, so they are going to probably be against this decision. But it doesn't really matter, ultimately.
President Hayes it was. This decision looked like it could split the country, but it was here that Tilden accepted defeat. Not because he recognised that he lost the election, but because most of his fellow Democrats weren't willing to cross certain lines. He'd also done a terrible job of pushing his claim. You see, most of his fellow Democrats weren't willing to cross certain lines. He'd also done a
I won, Tilden didn't win. Even if I didn't win, my friends will decide I was the closest to winning. I'm going to keep bothering you until you just get it. That's a very funny list of reasons why Hayes should be the president.
Terrible job of pushing his claim. You see, Tilden was, to use a technical term, loaded, and when his allies asked him to finance their preparations, he refused and instead kept quiet and basically waited to see if he would just be made president.
Which you could argue is a absent-minded or forgettable thing. I'd argue that he probably didn't want to fund an armed insurrection. He did not want conflict in his name. I mean, he probably still thinks that he won. He probably still thinks that he should be the president. But a sensible man is probably going to go, it's not worth the bloodshed that would come from it.
Whereas Hayes did not do this, and he was very clear that he had won and was going to be the next president. And anybody who disagreed was anti-democratic and probably smelled bad too. Tilden only became forceful after the commission had declared for Hayes, at which point it was too late because his backers had mostly calmed down. at least enough to put the guns away. Because whilst many Democrats and Southerners were angry with the outcome, they knew that another civil war was too awful to comprehend. Furthermore, given the slim majority that Republicans had won by, and given that many Democrats saw Tilden as a weak candidate, they didn't feel the need to push too hard, because they knew that they'd be guaranteed to win the next one. Spoiler alert, they did not.
Except they didn't. We already discussed this before too. Between the end of Andrew Johnson's term and Woodrow Wilson's election in 1912, there is a singular Democrat that wins the presidency, and that's Grover Cleveland to 2 non-consecutive terms, with Benjamin Harrison splitting the difference, which is just a wild reality. Today, if you look, it more or less just flip-flops back and forth. We get a lot of 2-term presidents from one party, and then it flips. That's not universal, but it's pretty consistent.
Now, there's a commonly held belief that says an informal agreement was made between the Democrats and the Republicans, known by some as the corrupt bargain of 1877, wherein the Democrats gave Hayes the presidency in return for him ending Reconstruction and withdrawing federal troops from the South.
Which was going to happen either way. The Union was not going to maintain any kind of, or the United States, it was so expensive, and public opinion had strongly turned against that occupation. It wasn't going to maintain too much longer. And Tilden would have arguably done it even quicker. But, yeah.
Now, he actually did do these things, but there's zero evidence of such an agreement ever being made. Now, of course, none of them would have actually written this down. It's just simply the case that Hayes was a much more moderate Republican, and he believed that Grant and his party had been far too harsh on the former Confederacy. Also, had this deal existed, then the House of Representatives almost certainly wouldn't have continually refused to acknowledge Hayes' presidency. It even went so far as to pass a bill stating that Tilden was the actual winner of the 1876 election and that Hayes' presidency was illegitimate. Realistically, of course,
it didn't go anywhere because the Senate did not agree with them, but
this didn't do anything except for make them feel better about the situation, but either way, the election was over. And so, civil war, whilst closer than many would have imagined, was made more likely due to a lack of process for a contested election. But it was ultimately prevented by the culture of democracy that the vast majority of Americans and their representatives held dear. Whilst of course people were extremely angry, the vast majority of politicians on both sides recognised the horrors of the Civil War could never be revisited, and that for the sake of themselves and the United States, maintaining a stable form of government trumped all else. Cooler heads had prevailed. I hope you enjoyed this.
Alright, another excellent video from him. Very good. I will see you guys in the next one. Let me know what else you'd like me to react to. Very sadly, I actually recorded a reaction to the newest Blue Jay video yesterday. And there was a weird mic issue, and after 3 minutes my mic cut out and everything else was just unavailable. So sadly, I won't be posting that, and I've got to wait probably another 5 months for a new Blue Jay video to react to. But either way, I hope you guys have a great day. Let me know what else you'd like me to react to. See you in the next one. Bye.